All right, we turn our attention now to Ephesians and Colossians. And we are going to start actually in the reverse order with Colossians. Here is a picture of the world of Paul's day, and you can see Colossae there, Laodicea. These cities were not far from each other, and they were an important part of this area in Asia Minor. So we begin looking at Colossians, a letter Paul writes, as we understand it, after his third missionary journey. You know, he goes to Jerusalem, and then he spends some time in prison in Caesarea. Then he goes to Rome, and it's thought that there in Rome that he writes the 4 different prison epistles. Now, we don't know that for certain. There's a possibility that he could have written these at some of the other locations that he was imprisoned. But that's just the general consensus and also the view in the early church. Now, the context of Colossians, if you think a little bit about it, it was, relatively speaking, a small town. It's about 100 miles east of Ephesus, not far from Laodicea, which is famous in the book of Revelation because it's the place where it says that they were lukewarm and he wanted to spew them out of his mouth. There's a reason for that, actually. It's because the aqueducts were in a particular location where the water came out warm, and by the time it got to the city, it was lukewarm and not very tasty. It was also not far from a place called Hierapolis, and this together formed a kind of a triangle known as the Lycus Valley. One of the things that we know happened there in Colossae was, this is an area in Phrygia where there was the worship of the god Cybele, and it's just one of the examples, also known as Agdistis by the Greeks. It is an example of sort of Roman religion and also local traditional religion that was at work. It seems possible that when Paul in chapter 2, verse 23, talks a little bit about the harsh treatment of the body, he may be referring to the way the worshipers of Cybele went about their religious devotion to this goddess. They would castrate themselves, or at least that was the myth associated with it, and it's believed that maybe some of them actually did this. So this is a part of the larger worship of this goddess, and it seems that part of what Paul is addressing in the letter is dealing with some of these local religious practices in this particular community. One of the things that's interesting about Colossae is that it actually had a very large Jewish population, perhaps 11,000 Jews living there. Another issue in Colossians is what's called stoicheia. That's the Greek word that has something to do with astrology. The ancient people were a fearful people, and they, obviously they worshiped the gods in hopes that they would be spared and freed and that sort of thing. But the folks living in this part of the world also were concerned about what Paul keeps calling the powers, which refers to powers that they believed were in the sky, the astral powers that were below the earth, the underworld, and even their own ancestors. They had kind of an ancestry kind of spirituality. So when you add that with the unpredictability of the gods, the Greek notion of fate, and that the stars in the sky, the astrology, controlled all the events of the world. They were sort of, your future was already set in the sky for you. And that there was sort of these elemental spirits, these stoicheia. This is part of what gave rise to the interest in things like astrology, practicing magic. It's also something that would have made what would have been of interest to the Jewish people, because one of the things that we know is that in Judaism, there were those who practiced magic. And there was this sort of tradition that went all the way back supposedly to Solomon, who had these, the special knowledge or the special wisdom, who could do these sorts of things. And so it's interesting that the people who practice magic sometimes are associated with a kind of a strange form of Judaism and Jewish practices. And that may also be playing into Paul's letter to the Colossians, where they have these kind of supernatural superstitions, and he's having to try to dispel that and say, listen, no, you don't understand. The gods of the world and the spiritual powers that you believe in and all of that, none of that pales in comparison to the greatness of Christ and the greatness of God. And all that other stuff just needs to be put aside, and we need to focus on Jesus. So at issue in Colossians, because of those other questions we just talked about, were some even bigger questions, like who is in charge of the universe? How does a Christian live in a pagan society? For example, should Christians remove themselves from the pagan society, practice asceticism, or maybe some form of isolation from everybody else? And this becomes interesting because in Colossians, there's a larger discussion about asceticism, and you don't eat certain things, and you deprive your body of certain things, and this sort of a thing. And Paul's also dealing with the idea that one's religion and piety does not mean that they get to control the powers of the universe or control the gods, because God is the one who's in charge. And so here's sort of the answers to those questions. The universe is controlled by a cosmic Christ. Christians must not syncretize, that is, they must not become like their pagan neighbors, but they should not practice asceticism or isolate themselves completely from those neighbors either. I mean, after all, how can you be the light of the world if you're hiding out in some cave somewhere, right? And also maybe the answer to the question why syncretism and eclecticism deny the exclusivity and sovereignty of Christ. Asceticism fails to make a person holy, Paul says, by just denying yourself from sexuality or denying yourself from food or denying yourself from these things doesn't actually make you any holier when you don't do them. Piety does not ultimately control God. You can't pray enough or do enough spiritual things to force God to do something. Now, if you just look at the book as a whole, he outlines his thoughts in the book in a typical Greek fashion of a letter. There's greetings and thanksgivings. And then he goes on to talk about the majesty of Christ and the mystery of Christ. He calls for them to have a steadfastness about themselves. He warns against philosophy and gives some practical exhortations and some personal notes in his closing. The book talks about the 4 tasks that are outlined in Colossians. The divinity of Jesus, Jesus contrasted with philosophy, behavior, what you should do, and greetings. Both the Old Testament people and the people of Paul's day had a kind of writing structure that they called the chiasm. That comes from the Greek X shaped letter. And a chiasm was a structure, a way of structuring thought that you would build up to a main point and then go in reverse direction from there. The chiasm is a way of structuring what you're saying so that the main point of what you're saying is placed in the middle of what you're saying. Again, it was common in the Old Testament. Well, the book of Colossians seems to be structured as a kind of chiasm. You have a body, a center, and the body of the Colossian letter has this central denunciation of philosophy and Paul's main aim in refuting his adversaries. And so that's one way to sort of structure the work. Paul writes, along with Timothy, to a church made up of Gentiles. Again, Colossae was written in a place where there were a lot of Jews, but it's also a church made up of Gentiles. And remember about how there were God-fearers, these Gentiles who would try to convert to Judaism, but wouldn't necessarily go all the way. It's interesting that based on what we see in chapter 2, verse 1, is that Paul does not know them, which is interesting. And then we're also told that Epaphras was the one who actually started this church, and he's one of Paul's co-workers. So he doesn't know them personally, but he's writing this letter to them anyway. Now, one of the things that's a big deal in the letter is we have a lot of Christology in Colossians. We have a lot of information about Christ in Colossians. He is described as the image of God, the creator of all things. He is the head. He is the firstborn from the dead. All of these are ways of talking about the supremacy and the greatness of Christ. They are what we would call a high Christology. Jesus is very much divine in the book of Colossians. Now, in terms of the quote-unquote philosophy, this is variously debated as to what Paul is confronting. Is he confronting some Jewish heresy, some pagan cult, some syncretism with paganism or some other system, or maybe an all of the above is meant by philosophy? So that's what we have to say about Colossians. Now let's turn our attention to Ephesians. And Colossians and Ephesians are together because of the similarity that they have. Ephesians has been called the greatest of all Paul's letters. It emphasizes and teaches us about the church. It has more of a general theme rather than a specific theme, which again indicates that it was perhaps written to more than one church, since it was sort of this broader kind of theme to it. And there's some speculation that, in fact, Ephesians was a circular letter that was written to all the churches that are on the circuitous route, mail route, that are in this part of Asia. The style of Ephesians is unique. It's almost liturgical, like something you'd use in the church. And it has some unique things. For example, there's a big long sentence that stretches out over 13, 14 verses, or I should say 11 or 12 verses in chapter 1, verse 3 through 14. Setting of Ephesus, it's the port city on the Aegean. There's tons of goods that go to Greece and back. It was the place of the Temple of Artemis, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Paul visited here on his second missionary journey and then came back here for 3 years on his third journey. One of the things that the book deals with is what Paul calls the dividing wall of hostility. And he talks about how Christ has broken down the wall, and so that we can be connected to God. If you're to outline the book, it would be greeting and prayer, church and work of Christ, obligations of the church, and a closing exhortation. Now, one of the things that happens in Ephesus, we know, is that the emperor was venerated here. And you can see it even on the Roman coinage here. The picture of the emperor is placed on there. You can see the word Caesar written out. Julius Caesar stressed his own divinity by associating himself with the mythic founder of the Roman race. And from then on, all the different figures in Rome and Roman history became thought of as divine in some sense. The letter of Ephesians seems to be geared toward Gentiles. There's a concern of them returning to their quote-unquote old ways, which wouldn't really fit with the Jewish audience as well. He talks about the cosmic spiritual powers. And one of the things that comes up in the book is sort of how best to kind of manage or run the church. Is it better to have harmony or equality, benevolent patriarchalism, or democracy? The book of Ephesians, if Colossians is about Christology, the book of Ephesians is about ecclesiology. Ecclesia is the Greek word for church, and so it means a study of the church. It contains a prayer for the church. There's a big emphasis on the oneness of Jew and Gentile. It talks about gifts that build up the church. And it rejects some of the things that would destroy the church, like anger, greed, or impurity. It talks also about family in chapter 5, and, children submitting to their parents, slaves submitting to their masters, wives submitting to their husbands. All of this fit within a Roman world and a Roman context where order and structure were seen to be divine. It was a microcosm, the family was, of Roman society. And it was strictly hierarchical with the father as the top of the family. Paul is simply addressing these issues within that Roman cultural mindset and against that Roman cultural worldview. The topic of submission is one that drives a lot of controversy today. And in chapter 5, verse 21, everyone is told to be submissive to someone out of a reverence for Christ himself. Wives are told to, slaves are told to, and husbands are told on how they should treat their wives. Women in antiquity were not perceived of in the same way that men were. There was a sense in which women were incomplete. If a woman was born with some kind of birth defect, it wasn't unusual for someone to just sort of get rid of that child. They were perceived of inferior mentally and physically. The daughters were, obviously given away by the fathers. Fathers had ultimate power and authority, life over their daughters, until they were ready to get married, in which case they were then put under the authority of their husbands. This is the way the Roman world worked. Now, when it comes to the book of Ephesians and Colossians, we have something kind of intriguing to deal with. There's so much vocabulary, style, grammar, and tone that are the same in the two letters, and then also a bit of inconsistency in history, theology, and ideas with Paul's other letters, that it always raises some questions among some who are a little bit more skeptical, suggesting maybe Paul didn't actually write the letter. In terms of some examples of some irregularities in Ephesians, Paul talks about diabolos, the devil, rather than satanos, Satan, as he would normally. He uses a term that he doesn't use elsewhere called heavenly realms. And he uses 80 different words that he never uses anywhere else in the rest of the New Testament, what we call hapax legomena. Now, the explanation for this is that, because there are hapax also in some other letters as well, that this change was in fact due to a new audience and the need to address a new topic. This is also similar to Paul's prayers, and thus kind of has a liturgical sense about it. These differences may be simply due to the fact that Paul is using a writing secretary. When using writing secretaries or an amanuensis, there was dictation or shorthand. They would also do editorial work. Examples of them include folks like Silas, who helps Peter in 1 Peter 5:12, Tertius, who helps Paul in writing Romans 16:22, and the fact that Paul will end his letters making the comment, I'm signing this, I'm writing this with my own hands. He does this in Corinthians and Galatians and Colossians, in 2 Thessalonians and in Philemon. And then there's always this question, did Luke help Paul write this letter? After all, he was his companion. So he says in Colossians 4:14. It's possible that this letter of Ephesians was never written to just one church. We actually have documentary evidence of that. One of the earliest ancient copies of the book of Ephesians, the name Ephesians is not found there. Instead, it's blank. And when you look at the manuscript, if you look at the physical manuscript, you can see that there was once written there the word Laodicea, which you sort of get the impression that maybe this letter was carried from church to church. They erased the word Ephesus and they put Laodicea or whatever other church they were going to visit, Pergamum, Thyatira, all the different letters, all the different churches and communities that were on that circuitous route. This would also explain one of the curious facets of the book of Ephesians, which is that Paul does not include any historical detail in terms of historical information in the letter, as he does elsewhere in his writings. There's also a mention in Colossians 4:16, which suggests an exchange of letters was taking place.